The moment Lady Isadora Pembroke received the invitation, she knew two things with absolute certainty. First, that the Duke of Ravenshire had lost his mind, and second, that she would be a fool to accept. But when had she ever been known for making sensible decisions? Her fingers tightened around the thick parchment as she read the words again, hoping they might change under scrutiny. They did not. The Duke, cold, calculating, and entirely too handsome for his own good, was hosting an archery tournament at Ravenshire Hall, and she, of all people, had been invited. More than invited, she was being summoned. "Surely this is a jest," she murmured, pacing the length of the drawing-room. The fire crackled behind her, sending flickering shadows dancing along the green damask wallpaper. "The Duke of Ravenshire would rather duel my father at dawn than offer me hospitality." Her cousin Charlotte snatched the letter from her hands with unladylike enthusiasm. "Perhaps he means to humiliate you," she offered, eyes alight with intrigue. "Or perhaps he's finally realized that war between your families is dreadfully tiresome and wishes to make peace." Isadora scoffed. The feud between the Pembrokes and the Dukes of Ravenshire spanned 2 generations, rooted in betrayal, scandal, and, if her father was to be believed, an unforgivable slight involving a stolen racehorse. The idea that a mere tournament could unravel such enmity was laughable, and yet the invitation was explicit. The Duke was extending his personal welcome, which meant this was no clerical mistake. He wanted her at Ravenshire Hall. Why? Her pulse quickened at the thought of facing him. Gabriel Montrose, Duke of Ravenshire, was a man of infuriating contradictions, a lord with the manners of a gentleman but the heart of a strategist, a rogue, who moved through society with effortless charm, while ensuring no one ever got close enough to wound him. He was as untouchable as he was dangerous. Charlotte nudged her elbow. "You're going, aren't you?" "I haven't decided." Charlotte rolled her eyes. "Yes, you have." Perhaps she had, because if there was one thing Lady Isadora Pembroke despised more than the Duke himself, it was not knowing what he was planning, and she intended to find out. Gabriel Montrose, Duke of Ravenshire, had been called many things in his lifetime: ruthless, arrogant, insufferable, but never reckless. And yet, as he stood in the grand hall of Ravenshire Manor, watching the final preparations for the tournament, he wondered if inviting Lady Isadora Pembroke had been his first true act of folly. The woman was a menace, stubborn, sharp-tongued, and entirely too clever for his liking. Her presence at his tournament would be like tossing a lit candle into a room filled with brandy-soaked drapes, and yet he had extended the invitation anyway. "You could have invited any lady in England," his friend Lord Stirling had said when Gabriel first revealed his plan. "And you chose her, the daughter of the man who would see you ruined?" Yes, he had. Because this tournament was more than a mere display of sport. It was a game of strategy, and Lady Isadora was a crucial piece on the board. Gabriel's jaw tightened as he surveyed the archery targets being set up on the west lawn. The air smelled of damp earth and freshly cut grass, the sky a crisp autumn blue. His estate had hosted countless events before, but none so significant as this. If all went according to plan, the outcome would shift the course of 2 warring families forever. He had to ensure she played her part. "Your Grace," came a voice behind him. He turned to see Lord Stirling approaching, a knowing smirk on his face. "I just heard the most fascinating piece of gossip. Lady Isadora is en route to Ravenshire Hall as we speak." Gabriel did not allow his satisfaction to show. "Of course she is." Stirling crossed his arms. "And you truly believe this will end well?" Gabriel exhaled slowly, allowing himself a rare, fleeting moment of doubt. Then, shaking it off, he met his friend's gaze with the confidence of a man who never lost. "I do not believe," he said. "I know." Lady Isadora Pembroke had faced duels of wit, braved the disdain of the ton, and once successfully outmaneuvered a particularly aggressive swan at Hyde Park. Yet nothing had quite prepared her for the sight of Ravenshire Hall looming before her. The estate was a fortress of power and prestige, its stone facade bathed in the golden hues of late afternoon. Towers framed the vast estate, and banners bearing the Montrose crest fluttered in the crisp autumn breeze. It was, by all accounts, impressive, just like its owner. And much like its owner, it made Isadora want to turn her horse around and flee in the opposite direction. "Are you sure about this?" Charlotte whispered from beside her in the carriage, eyes darting between Isadora and the grand entrance ahead. "No," Isadora admitted, smoothing the folds of her deep green riding habit. "But I am already here, and I refuse to give the Duke the satisfaction of thinking I hesitated." Before Charlotte could respond, the carriage door swung open, and a footman extended a hand. Taking a deep breath, Isadora stepped out, lifting her chin in defiance of the sinking feeling in her stomach. She had barely taken 2 steps when a familiar voice, rich and laced with amusement, reached her ears. "Lady Isadora." She turned, heart hammering despite herself. And there he was, Gabriel Montrose, Duke of Ravenshire, dressed in a tailored black coat that did nothing to soften the air of command he carried like a second skin. His dark brown hair was slightly tousled, as though he had just run a hand through it in frustration, and his green eyes held the glint of a man who had already won a game she had not even realized she was playing. "Your Grace," Isadora curtsied, her expression schooled into polite indifference. "How generous of you to invite me to your tournament. I must admit, I was surprised." "Were you?" He stepped closer, the ghost of a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "I was under the impression that you enjoy a challenge. Or have I misjudged you?" "Oh, he was insufferable." "I do enjoy a challenge," she said sweetly, "which is precisely why I accepted. I have every intention of winning." His smirk deepened. "How fortunate, then, that I have every intention of ensuring you do not." The air between them crackled with something indefinable, something neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge. Charlotte coughed delicately. "What a pleasant reunion. Perhaps we might go inside before one of you sets fire to the gravel drive with sheer willpower." Gabriel chuckled, but his gaze never left Isadora. "By all means, Lady Pembroke, do step inside my home." And with that, he turned and strode toward the entrance, as though utterly certain that she would follow. Isadora inhaled sharply. He was playing a game. What she did not yet know was why, but she intended to find out. Dinner at Ravenshire Hall was, predictably, an exquisite affair. Candlelight flickered off polished silverware, chandeliers cast a warm glow over the long mahogany table, and the scent of roasted pheasant and spiced wine filled the grand dining hall. Isadora might have admired it all if she weren't acutely aware of the man seated at the head of the table, Gabriel Montrose. The Duke of Ravenshire was watching her again, the weight of his gaze like a challenge unspoken. He was too composed, too certain, and it set her teeth on edge. "Tell me, Lady Pembroke," he drawled, swirling the wine in his goblet, "what inspired you to take up archery? I was under the impression that most young ladies prefer pastimes of a gentler nature." Isadora did not rise to the bait, at least not immediately. Instead, she took a measured sip of her own wine, allowing a small, deliberate pause before answering. "Well, Your Grace, I find that embroidery does not offer the same satisfaction as striking a target dead center." She smiled sweetly. "But I do understand why some men might prefer women to confine themselves to quieter pursuits. It must be rather unsettling to be bested." A chuckle rippled through the guests. Across from her, Charlotte gave an approving nod. Lord Stirling, Gabriel's ever-present companion, smirked over the rim of his glass. Gabriel, however, merely tilted his head, the amusement in his eyes sharpening into something else. "Oh, I assure you, Lady Pembroke," he said, voice smooth as silk, "I am not easily unsettled. Their gazes locked, and for a brief moment the hum of conversation around them faded into the background. The game had begun in earnest. To Isadora's left, Lord William Armitage, a viscount with a perpetually bemused expression, cleared his throat. "I must say, Lady Pembroke, your presence here is quite the surprise. I never imagined I would see a Pembroke and a Montrose seated at the same table without dueling pistols involved." A ripple of nervous laughter followed, but Isadora kept her expression serene. "Well, Lord Armitage, I suppose there is a first time for everything." Gabriel's lips twitched. "Indeed, who knows? By the end of the tournament, perhaps we shall all be the best of friends." Isadora met his gaze, unflinching. Or the worst of enemies, a beat of silence. Then Gabriel's slow, knowing smile. Dinner continued, the conversation flowing around them, but the undercurrent of tension remained. Isadora could not shake the feeling that the Duke had set this entire evening in motion with a purpose yet to be revealed, and she was determined to uncover it before he had the chance to use it against her. The morning of the tournament arrived crisp and clear, the scent of damp earth and autumn leaves lingering in the air. Ravenshire's west lawn had been transformed into an arena of competition, with archery targets lined in perfect symmetry, their painted rings gleaming under the early sunlight. A small crowd had gathered, lords and ladies wrapped in fine wool cloaks, murmuring in excitement as competitors took their places. Lady Isadora Pembroke stood among them, adjusting the grip on her bow. The smooth wood was familiar beneath her fingers, the weight of it grounding. She had spent years perfecting her aim, years proving that she was more than what society expected of her, and today she intended to prove it once more. "Are you nervous, Lady Pembroke?" A smooth voice murmured near her ear. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Gabriel Montrose. The Duke had appeared at her side like a shadow, clad in a dark riding coat that made him look every inch the composed aristocrat. He watched her, with that insufferable half-smirk, as if he already knew how this would end. "Nervous?" Isadora lifted a brow. "Your Grace, if I were any more at ease, I might take a nap between rounds." Gabriel chuckled. "Ah, so you are confident." "Of course." She turned her gaze toward the targets. "Aren't you?" "I am always confident," he said too casually. "But I do wonder, what will you do if you lose?" Isadora's grip on her bow tightened. Lose? She had no intention of doing so. "An interesting question," she said smoothly, "but a pointless one." Gabriel hummed, unconvinced. Then, with a slight nod, he stepped back. "Very well. Let us see what you can do." A hush fell over the crowd as the tournament began. The first few competitors took their shots, arrows slicing through the air, some hitting their marks, others falling just short. Then it was Isadora's turn. She stepped forward, exhaling slowly. The world narrowed to the bow in her hands, the taut string, the distant target. She loosed the arrow. A whisper of wind, a sharp thud. Dead center, a murmur of approval spread through the spectators, but Isadora didn't turn to acknowledge it. She already knew she had hit her mark. Gabriel's voice drifted toward her, low and amused. "Impressive." Isadora allowed herself a small smile. "I know." But as she stepped back, her victory settled uneasily in her stomach. This was only the beginning, and she knew Gabriel Montrose well enough to be certain he never entered a game he did not intend to win. The real question was, what prize was he playing for? Gabriel Montrose stepped forward, the bow resting easily in his grip, as if it had been made for him. The crowd quieted, eager to see how the Duke of Ravenshire would fare against Lady Isadora Pembroke's flawless shot. Isadora told herself she didn't care, that it didn't matter. And yet she watched him with a sharpened focus, her breath caught somewhere between irritation and curiosity. With a measured ease, Gabriel notched his arrow, raised his arm, and released. Thud! The arrow struck the target, with effortless precision, landing directly beside hers, in the very center. A murmur rippled through the spectators. Isadora's fingers curled into her skirts. Gabriel tilted his head, considering the target with exaggerated thoughtfulness. A fine shot, wouldn't you say? Isadora forced a smile. Adequate. His lips twitched, amused. High praise indeed, Lady Pembroke. Lord Stirling, ever the observer, stepped closer with a knowing grin. A tie. How intriguing. I suppose we will need another round to determine the winner, Charlotte added, her eyes gleaming with mischief. Gabriel's gaze flicked to Isadora. Unless, of course, you wish to concede. She let out a laugh, soft and incredulous. To you? I would sooner take up embroidery. Then we continue. The tournament pressed on, but the air had changed. The rivalry between Isadora and Gabriel was no longer a distant feud between two families. It was personal now, electric, with each exchanged glance, each careful move. And then the Duke did something unexpected. During a brief intermission, while the guests milled about, Gabriel stepped toward Isadora, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You don't trust me? Isadora stiffened. Should I? His lips curved, though there was something unreadable in his eyes. I wonder if you even trust yourself. She turned fully to him, meeting his gaze head-on. And what is that supposed to mean? He studied her for a long moment before shaking his head slightly. Nothing at all. Then, before she could press further, he was gone, disappearing into the throng of noblemen and ladies as if the conversation had never happened. But it had happened. And the worst part? He was right. The final round of the tournament was announced just before dusk, the setting sun casting long shadows over Ravenshire's west lawn. The air had turned crisp, the murmurs of the crowd filled with eager anticipation. It was no longer a simple contest. It was a battle of wills. Lady Isadora Pembroke adjusted her stance, her bow steady in her hands, despite the quickened beat of her pulse. Across from her, Gabriel Montrose looked as infuriatingly composed as ever, his dark green coat unbuttoned at the top, as though even fate itself bent to his comfort. This is it, Charlotte whispered beside her. One last shot. Isadora exhaled slowly. She could do this. The rules of the final round were clear. One arrow, one shot. The target moved 10 paces farther than before. Precision was key. Gabriel stepped forward first. With practiced ease, he notched his arrow, drew back the string and released. Thud. The arrow landed just shy of the absolute center, a breath away from perfection. The crowd murmured in admiration. Gabriel turned to her, his expression unreadable. Your turn, Lady Pembroke. She stepped forward, rolling her shoulders back, refusing to let him see the flicker of hesitation curling in her stomach. This was her moment. Her fingers wrapped around the bowstring, pulling it back with careful precision. Her heartbeat slowed. She exhaled, released. Thud. The arrow struck to dead center. A moment of silence stretched over the crowd before applause erupted. Isadora allowed herself a triumphant smile, turning to Gabriel with lifted brows. Well, Grace, she asked sweetly, would you like to concede now? To her surprise, Gabriel didn't look displeased. In fact, he looked satisfied, as if she had done exactly what he had expected. Not at all, he said smoothly, stepping closer. Victory suits you, Lady Pembroke. But tell me, his voice dipped lower, do you truly believe the prize was ever about an arrow? Her breath hitched. There was something else at play here, something deeper, and for the first time, she wasn't entirely sure she was the one winning. The applause still echoed in the air when Gabriel Montrose extended his hand toward Isadora, his emerald green eyes glinting with something unreadable. Walk with me, he said softly. Not a command, but not quite a request either. Isadora hesitated. Every instinct told her that whatever came next would change everything. And yet, she found herself nodding, slipping her hand into his without thought. The touch was brief, his palm warm against hers, before he released her and led her away from the gathering. The soft murmur of guests faded as they strolled past. The gardens, their steps crunching over the gravel path. The evening air carried the scent of roses, mingled with the distant smoke of torches being lit. "Will you tell me now why I am truly here?" Isadora finally asked, breaking the silence. Gabriel exhaled, stopping beneath the arch of a stone gazebo. "Because I needed you to win." She blinked, folding her arms. "Well, that is a rather poor strategy. Typically, one does not invite a rival to defeat them." A low chuckle escaped him. "No, one does not, unless, of course, the victory is part of something far greater." A shiver danced down Isadora's spine. "Stop speaking in riddles, Your Grace." Gabriel studied her for a long moment, then reached inside his coat. He withdrew a small folded parchment and pressed it into her hand. "Read it." Her fingers tightened around the paper as she slowly unfolded it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words... Her breath caught. This was a letter, a secret letter, addressed to her father, written years ago and signed by Gabriel's father. Her pulse pounded as she scanned the contents. A deal, a broken agreement, a betrayal, and at the heart of it all, a name, her mother's name. Isadora's gaze snapped up, but Gabriel was already watching her, his expression unreadable. "Our family's feud," he said quietly, "was built on a lie." The world shifted beneath her feet. Nothing would ever be the same again. Isadora's fingers trembled around the letter as she read it again, her breath coming in uneven bursts. She needed to believe she had misread the words, that the ink had smudged, that Gabriel Montrose was playing some cruel trick. But the truth stood unshaken before her. Her mother, the woman who had died when Isadora was a child, whose name was rarely spoken in the Pembroke household. She had been at the heart of the feud. And this letter, signed by the former Duke of Ravenshire, suggested that whatever had torn their families apart had not been about land, money, or a stolen racehorse. It had been about her mother. She lifted her gaze to Gabriel. "Explain." Her voice was steady, but barely. Gabriel exhaled slowly, as if he had anticipated this moment, yet dreaded it nonetheless. "Years ago, our fathers made a pact. My father promised yours something, someone. And then he broke that promise." Isadora's grip on the parchment tightened. "My mother," a solemn nod. "Your father was supposed to marry her, but my father intervened. He helped her escape, helped her marry the man she truly loved." "My father," she whispered. "Yes." Gabriel's jaw clenched. "And when your father found out, he declared war on mine. He painted him as a traitor, a man who stole from him, who humiliated him in front of the ton." He exhaled. "But the truth is, my father saved your mother from a fate she did not want." The words settled between them, heavier than stone. Isadora staggered back a step. "And you're only telling me this now?" Gabriel studied her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "Would you have believed me before today?" The answer hovered on her tongue. No, because she had spent her entire life believing her father's version of events, believing the Montroses were ruthless, cruel, dishonorable. And yet, she had never understood why the feud had begun. Her father had always been vague, unwilling to discuss the details. She had assumed it was about power, but this was something far more personal. And then another thought struck her, sharp as an arrow. "Why did you bring me here?" Her voice was quieter now, almost afraid of the answer. Gabriel hesitated, and in that moment, Isadora saw something rare in him. Uncertainty. I needed you to know the truth, he admitted. I needed someone in your family to know. The weight of his words pressed against her ribs. She had spent years hating him, and now she didn't know what to feel. But one thing was certain. If this was the truth, her father had been lying to her for years, and she intended to find out why. The Pembroke townhouse in London had always been a place of quiet elegance, a sanctuary from the demands of society. But as Isadora stormed through the grand foyer, her riding cloak barely removed, the very walls seemed to tremble beneath the weight of her fury. Her father, Lord Alistair Pembroke, stood near the fireplace in his study, a crystal glass of brandy in hand. He did not look surprised to see her, only mildly inconvenienced. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" he asked, swirling the amber liquid lazily. Isadora slammed the letter onto his desk. "You tell me." Lord Pembroke's gaze flickered to the parchment, then back to her. "Where did you get this?" "That does not matter," she snapped. "Is it true?" A beat of silence. Then, with an infuriating sigh, he set his glass down and lowered himself into his leather chair. "So the Duke has finally decided to meddle in matters that do not concern him." Isadora's pulse pounded. "Do not twist this. Did you lie? To me? Did you build this ridiculous feud over a broken betrothal?" Her father's expression darkened. "I built nothing. It was he, the former Duke of Ravenshire, who humiliated me. Your mother was promised to me. Her father gave his word, and yet she ran." He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "I loved her, or at least I believed I did, and I would have made her a fine husband." Isadora's stomach twisted. "She didn't want to marry you? She did not know what was best for her." The words hung between them, cold and heavy. Isadora swallowed hard. "And so you destroyed an entire family's name for your wounded pride?" Lord Pembroke's jaw tightened. "You think this is simple? Do you think I enjoyed being made a fool of? My honor, our name, was dragged through the mud. Society laughed behind my back, Isadora, and I swore that the Montrose family would pay for it." Her hands curled into fists. "And what of me?" she whispered. "Did you ever consider what filling my head with lies would cost me?" For the first time, her father looked uncertain, but the moment passed, and he steeled himself once more. "The Montroses are not to be trusted. You would do well to remember that." Isadora shook her head, stepping back. "No," she said quietly. "I think the only person I cannot trust is you." The words struck their mark, but she did not. "Stay to watch the wound land." She turned on her heel, cloak billowing behind her, and walked out. She had spent years believing one truth. Now she had to decide what to do with another, and she knew exactly where she needed to be. Epilogue. The wind was crisp as Isadora rode through the gates of Ravenshire Hall, her heart pounding harder than it had during the tournament. Gabriel was waiting. He stood at the top of the stone steps, arms crossed over his chest, watching her, with that unreadable expression he always wore when he was trying to hide something. She dismounted, handed the reins to a stable boy, and climbed the steps with determined strides. "I confronted my father," she said without preamble. "He admitted it." Gabriel didn't move. "And yet you are here." She exhaled sharply. "I didn't come to tell you that you were right." His lips twitched. "Didn't you?" She huffed, but there was no real anger behind it. "I came because I don't know what happens next. I don't know what this means." She hesitated. "For me, for you." Gabriel stepped closer, his gaze intense. "For us." The word sent something skittering through her chest. "Us," she swallowed. "Yes." Silence stretched between them, thick and charged. Then, finally, Gabriel exhaled and shook his head almost in disbelief. "I invited you to Ravenshire for a reason, Isadora," he said softly. "Not just for the tournament. not just for the truth. He hesitated, then murmured, "I wanted to see what would happen if we stopped pretending we were meant to be enemies." Her breath caught. Gabriel Montrose, the infuriating, impossible Duke, had been playing a different game all along. And for the first time in her life, Isadora Pembroke was glad to lose. A slow smile curled her lips. "Well," she murmured, stepping closer, "perhaps I do enjoy a challenge." His answering smile was nothing short of victorious. And when he finally reached for her, there was no battle left to fight. The end